Greetings. Once again, I don't have a videographer, so I apologize for walking in front of the camera. You'll notice that I'm in a different place. That's because I'm in a different state at a different school, because I needed to get caught up and make sure I got this in on time. For today, what we're going to be talking about is culture. We're going to talk about what it is, how it comes about. We're going to look at some of the principles involved with culture. We're going to look at how we define different cultures and classify them. And we're going to look at some of the ways in which we can improve our intercultural communication. So, first off, what is it? Well, culture is everything about a group that makes that group, right? It's their specialized lifestyle that a group has that is passed from one generation to the next, and it's based not on genetics, but on communication, sharing of knowledge, sharing of beliefs, sharing of values, sharing of language, of religion, of behavior, of methodology, of thought. It's, culture is everything about that group that makes it that group. Artifacts, language, religion, everything. And I'm going to ask you a question. How many cultures do you think you are part of? 1, 2, 3? I would say the answer is dozens. Dozens of cultures. If you're on a sports team, your family, your immediate family, your extended family, your school, your work, those are all cultures, right? They all have their own language, they all have their own beliefs, they all have their own rules. And a lot of those rules might be similar, but ultimately they're not identical. So they're all different cultures. This class is a culture of its own. And so culture's huge. It's around us, it dominates us, and we are living in a time that is very, very culturally diverse. Not just in the sense of people from other countries, but even people from other, religious groups or from other areas of the country. It's all mixing together. So we as a culture are becoming way more culturally diverse than we were even 10 years ago. So that's what culture is. Now, how do we learn culture? Well, we're going to get to that in a second, but first we're going to have a little note on culture and gender. Because different cultures view gender very differently, and that's even compounded, that confusion is compounded a little bit more when you talk about sex. Now, sex is a biological thing, right? Sex is what's between your legs, gender is what's between your ears. That's an easy way to remember it. And every culture has different expectations of gender, which is why in some cultures, women are treated very differently than the men. Where in other cultures, everybody's treated pretty much the same. And we'll talk about gender and cultures throughout this chapter, but that's just like a little note. It's in your book first, and so I felt like I should also state that little bit of a kind of a caveat before we get into things. Now, how do we learn culture? Well, we learn culture from 2 sources. And these are very important and they're very different. The first of these is enculturation. This is culture that is transmitted from one generation to the next. This is your ethnic identity. This is from the culture that you learn from your family, your friends, your school, your church. You are born into this. That's what enculturation means. Acculturation is when your culture mixes with that of another culture and you learn rules and norms of that different culture. So when you are exposed to a new culture, your culture actually changes because you adapt, whether you realize it or not, you adapt and respond to that culture, and you probably adopt some of their culture without even realizing it. So that's acculturation. Enculturation, you're born into it, you learn it from your family and friends, it's your from day one. Acculturation is what you learn when your culture mixes with another culture. And actually, when your culture mixes with another culture, you actually have 3 cultures, right? You have your culture, their culture, and then the mixed culture. And that's what we're seeing more and more today, is cultures mixing and forming almost entirely new cultures. And as I said, culture is very, very important for a lot of different reasons. It creates demographic changes. You know, as populations change, cultures shift. And you know, it used to be in New York, the culture was this way, but then because of people coming in, it changed completely the culture. You know, as culture comes in, it changes how you view and view other cultures as far as sensitivity. You know, in the United States, it used to be when cultures would come in, their job was to assimilate, right? To eradicate their old culture and adopt their new culture. But as our society becomes more and more culturally diverse, we stop trying to eradicate their original culture, and we want people to retain their original cultures. We want them to maintain that. Now, that doesn't mean we want them to maintain that at the expense of our culture. We want there to be a mix of cultures. We, as a society, have become more open to that. You know, understanding other cultures is important economically, because across the globe, we are economically interdependent. And we've talked about that term interdependence. It means the same thing here. What happens in a South African country, I shouldn't say South African country, I should say a country in the southern part of Africa, has an impact economically on what happens here. We see this in the Middle East with oil, right? Something happens over there, there's internal conflict, and our cost of gas goes up because we are culturally linked with everybody across the globe. And so it's important for us to understand other cultures. You know, communication technology has made the idea of intercultural communication that much more common and that much more easy. And so it makes sense to better communicate interculturally with other people, to avoid conflict, to avoid miscommunication, and so on. So interpersonal communication with people from other cultures is often tricky because those cultures have different practices. They have different nonverbal signals. They have different verbal symbols, right? They have different language. They have different nonverbal language. And so when it's important to understand this, because if you're dealing with people from another culture, you have to adapt, as do they. It's not just a one-way street. Both parties have to adapt, or there's going to be issues. For example, my uncle is the president and CEO of a tool and die company in Meadville, PA, C&J Industries. And many years ago, back in the 90s, he started to have to go to China for a variety of reasons. And when he first went, he had not spent a lot of time trying to understand the interpersonal communication within the Chinese culture. So when he went over there was a lot of conflict because he was approaching it from the perspective of an American businessman. They were approaching it from the perspectives of Chinese businessmen, and it caused conflict. Like the fact that they wouldn't make eye contact. My uncle thought that was very uncomfortable that they wouldn't make eye contact. He thought it was very awkward that they never said no to anything, but then they wouldn't fulfill their promises. Because in many Asian cultures, they don't like to say no. They just don't. They'll say yes, but then they just won't do it. Because to them, that's easier than saying no. And so it's important to understand culture and intercultural communication for a lot of different reasons. You know, the goal here to learn about culture and cultural communication is, you know, it's important. You want to adapt yourself to a much more cultural perspective because this is going to lead to better communication overall. You're going to understand better. You're going to be more flexible with people from other cultures. You're just going to be able to communicate better. It's common sense, right? Your job success might depend on it. Your success as a student might depend on understanding people from other cultures. I had a professor when I was in undergrad who was from India, and there were a lot of things that she did that at first were pretty strange, but then I actually was taking an intercultural communication class at the same time, And I actually learned that some of the stuff that she was doing is perfectly normal for that particular culture. And for me and the other students, we just had to learn to adapt to that a little bit so we could better communicate with the professor. So, culture influences us, but it doesn't determine necessarily everything. There are times when we do choose to go against our cultural practices. I know plenty of Asian people that will look you in the eye. I know plenty of, people who normally are very touchy, who don't like to be very touchy. So, while culture is central to who we are, it doesn't necessarily define us. And sometimes we tend to use culture as an excuse. Oh, I'm only doing that because that's my culture. I hear this a lot with students. Well, I'm not reading and I'm not reading my assignments because, people don't read nowadays. Well, that's using your kind of a cultural bad behavior to excuse your bad behavior. And that's kind of unacceptable because you are capable of overcoming cultural influences. We do it all the time, and the thing about culture is we're all different culturally. That's okay. But guess what? We have a lot of cultural similarities too. And we'll talk about some of these as we go throughout this chapter. Ultimately, culture is more of a guide to who we are and how we communicate. It's not set in stone. So don't let your culture stop you from growing or communicating effectively with people from other cultures. That's to quote Alton Brown, that's not good eats. Now we're going to take a look at some of the cultural principles that define cultures, that make them similar. These apply to all cultures. There are principles that define communication efficiency. There are rules, right? The quantity principle, the quality principle, relation principle, manner principle. Quantity principle basically states that most cultures, within those cultures, most people are only going to communicate as much information as is necessary to communicate our intended meaning, right? Now, that doesn't mean that some people don't go overboard, but as a general rule, we communicate what is needed to convey a message, and that's it. Quality basically says we communicate what we believe to be true, not what we know to be false. Now, that doesn't mean that some people aren't shady and communicate false information, but as a general rule, most cultures communicate what they believe to be true. Now, they may be false, but they believe it to be true, meaning there aren't cultures out there whose entire job is to mislead you through communication. Relation principle, this basically states that we tend to communicate specifically with things that are relevant to conversation. We don't just randomly talk about random things. Now, may know individual people who do that, but as a whole, we tend to stay focused with our communication. And the manner principle, we try to communicate in a way that is clear, that is unambiguous, that is focused and brief, and organize our thoughts in a way that makes sense. Again, you may know individuals who aren't like that, but as a whole, cultures tend to communicate in ways to make it more efficient. That's what all of these, these four principles are really all about, is all cultures communicate as efficiently as possible. Now, that may cause conflict, that may cause miscommunication, but they are doing the best they can. So if you're dealing with a culture and you don't feel like they're communicating enough, if you don't feel like they're sharing enough, don't get mad, don't get angry, because to them, they are doing exactly what they should. I know a lot of Asian cultures, they don't share information, personal information, but sometimes personal information is pertinent to the particular conversation, and so you're feeling, if you're communicating with them, that they're not communicating enough. But to them, they're communicating more than enough. You have to read between the lines. But in America, we don't do that. We're pretty direct, we're straightforward. Culturally, we share very similar ways of maintaining relationships. If you look in your book, it says peaceful relations, self-denigration, politeness. peaceful relations means we tend to, in public, try to preserve peaceful relationships. Meaning, there aren't cultures out there where it's okay to just start blasting people in public when you have a conflict with them. Now, there might be individuals, but as a cultural rule, we don't do that. Most cultures don't do that. So, self-denigration, a lot of times cultures they do not practice as a whole taking credit where credit isn't deserved. Individuals will do that, but cultures don't teach that. Cultures teach most people to be, to focus on the other, to push yourself down in the extent of not always taking credit for everything. Although some cultures, I think, push the boundaries of that, especially cultures that are focused on the self, the I, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Politeness, most societies, most cultures try to be polite in their communication. Now, the idea of politeness is universal, but the definition of what is polite is not always the same. And the point of this slide, the point of this past 5 or 6 minutes, is basically just showing you that when it comes to communication, when it comes to maintaining relationships, cultures are more alike than they are different. And so, even though somebody's from a different culture than you are, it doesn't mean that you can't effectively communicate, because you are more similar than you realize. And so that's what this last 5 minutes has been about. Now the next 10 or 15 minutes is going to be about how cultures are different and how we define cultural differences and how those cultural differences affect how we communicate. And there are basically 6 ways in which we define culture. The book says 7, but I don't talk about the one because I just don't think it's worthwhile. But this is how we classify all culture. So all culture falls into these categories. And the first of these categories is individualistic cultures versus collectivistic cultures. In an individualistic culture, the focus is on the individual or the small family group as opposed to the larger group. In an individualistic culture, your responsibility is for you, not everybody else. You focus more on individual goals. Success within that culture is measured by individual accomplishment as opposed to competitive, or as opposed to team success. People in individualistic cultures prefer competition. They like conflict because that's how they improve. And America is number 1 on there's a graph here on your PowerPoints which you can see, number 1 on the individualistic culture chart. And we'll talk about how individualist versus collectivistic affects communications here in a few minutes. But the other side of that coin is collectivistic. Collectivistic cultures are the opposite. For them, the focus is the group, not the individual. Group success is more important than individual success. So in a group, in a collectivistic culture, you personally might not do well, but as long as the group succeeds, you're happy. You see this when they interview sports stars that are from Japan or other Asian cultures. When an American football player does awesome, but his team fails, what do you hear him talking about in many cases? Oh, I did awesome, but but they don't really talk about their team. But when an Asian star does well, but his team fails, he says, I let my team down. Because to him, even though he did well, the team failed, and to him that's more important. It's all about saving face, and face is a concept that's public self-image. Collectivistic cultures are very, very much on face saving. Collectivistic cultures they avoid conflict. They don't like competition. They tend to be focused on group harmony. Even when they know that they are right, they will not necessarily stand up and say, I'm right, you're wrong. They don't do that because to them, group harmony is more important than whether or not they are right or wrong. And how does that affect how you communicate? Well, it affects how you communicate in a lot of different ways. It affects your self-esteem and your self-concept too. If you are from an individualistic culture where success is measured in individual success, but you don't succeed well, but you're good at helping other people. Like, for example, myself. I live in America. It's an individualistic culture. I often feel like my self-esteem is lowered because a lot of my skills, a lot of the things that I'm good at, are designed for helping other people. And so I'm great at helping other people, but as a result, often I don't have that same kind of success. So I feel like, I feel bad, I feel sad, because yeah, I'm good at helping other people, but that's not helping me. And that's because my culture says that I'm more important than the group, so in my mind, I deserve a certain amount of success. And when I don't get it, I feel bad about myself. If you're in a collectivistic culture and you have skills that are designed for the individual but not helping the group, you're also going to have low self-esteem. So let's say you have that Asian sports star who is fantastic, best baseball player in the world, but they're on a team that's terrible. They're going to constantly feel down and bummed out because even though they're great, their team doesn't have success. That's why you see a lot of those guys come over here, because here they can be in a little bit more of an individualistic society. And so that is how, whether you're in an individualistic or collectivistic culture, can affect your self-esteem, which we've talked about before, how that can affect your communication. So that's the first way in which we classify cultures. Individualistic, collectivistic. Another way in which we classify cultures has to do with where the emphasis of a message occurs. You have high context, you have low context. High context cultures are cultures where the emphasis is put in the person. Meaning, if you're in a high context culture and you communicate, you are relying on that person to interpret the message as they see fit. They tend to be collectivistic cultures. They focus more on oral agreements as opposed to written agreements because, again, it allows that receiver to interpret it. As a result, it can lead to vague information, especially if you don't have the same shared code. So if I'm communicating with somebody from a high context culture and they're expecting me to interpret it a certain way, but I don't have the same code as they do, I'm not going to interpret it the same way that they do. People in high context cultures tend to be less direct, a little bit more indirect when they speak. They beat around the bush. So a high context culture would never say to you, hey, why are you late? Because that would risk damaging your face. They would risk embarrassing you. They would say something along the lines of, did you get stuck in traffic? Did your alarm clock not go off? So the implied message is, why are you late? But they're saying it in a way that's indirect, allowing you to interpret it as you see fit. On the other side of that coin, you have low context cultures. Low context cultures are the information is in the words, right? The emphasis is on the actual language, the written message. These tend to be individualistic cultures. They're very straightforward. They're very direct. Why are you late today? They don't care about face. Why are you late today? The messages are much more direct, much more specific than they are in a high context culture. They often are forced to rely on nonverbal cues more because sometimes the message is so direct it's hard to tell if it's anger or whatever. So that's the second one. Now we'll talk more about high context, low context in the language chapter, which is the next chapter. The next one is high and low power distance. And power distance is the distance between the people in charge and the people who are not in charge. And a high power distance, that distance is great. Only a few people hold power. Ordinary citizens have little to no power, and they can never rise up in these kind of cultures. In a high context culture, high power distance culture, you generally don't communicate with the leaders. And when you do communicate with the leaders, it's very specific, it's very regimented, it's very it's very planned. You don't just roll up and start talking to a high power distance culture. And the thing is about high power distance is the people in high power distance cultures think that that's natural. They think, oh, that's just the way it is. So they don't really speak out and try to change it. Think of dictatorships. Dictatorships are high power distance cultures. You don't see a lot of communication from the little people to those in charge because the people in charge, or the little people, don't want to end up as a head in a dumpster because they are afraid of what that leader is going to do. They can't assume leadership roles in a high power distance culture. You know, you're either going to become a leader because you kill somebody else and you take over in a coup, or you're a family, it's like a royal thing and you're a family member. That's about it. You know, that's the only way you're going to assume power in a high power distance culture. And the little people just accept it as natural. That's just how it is. And so nothing really changes because they don't have that communication ability to change things. Again, think of dictators. Dictators are high power distance cultures. And although with the internet, things are changing. We see that, you know, with the Middle Eastern Spring that happened over the last, 6 or 7 years, we start to see a lot of cultures in the Middle East shifting more towards low power distance cultures, although the success of that is debatable. But because the internet opens things up and it gives these people much more of a voice than they had before. Now the other side of that coin is low power distance culture. And low power distance cultures are cultures where the power is distributed much more evenly. The average person can actually rise up to become a much more equal person, right? Anybody can theoretically become a member of the leading group. It's easier to communicate with people, with the leaders in a low power distance culture because you don't necessarily fear them. For example, if President Obama walked in this room, I wouldn't be afraid to say, I disagree with some of your policies. Whereas if I was in a high power distance culture, I would never say that because I didn't want to end up as a head in the dumpster, right? So, but because I'm in a low power distance culture, I don't have that fear. Now that doesn't mean I'm not going to respect him because I respect the office of President of the United States. So I'm going to be respectful, but I'm also not going to be afraid to communicate my actual thoughts. We talk more about how power distance affects language choices in the next chapter in language again. But it certainly does. You know, what you say and how you say it is going to be very different whether you're in a low power distance or high power distance. And so, high power distance, think of any dictatorships. Cuba, China, North Korea, a lot of Middle Eastern countries are high power distance. Low power distance are going to be any of the Western cultures, America, Canada, Australia, England. Even though England has the royal family, they don't actually rule. They're not in charge, and they haven't been since like the late 1600s. It's the parliament that rules and the prime minister who has more power. And anybody can theoretically rise to that. Now, I believe America is actually changing and moving more from a low power distance to a high power distance, and that is based, in my opinion, on money, because in America, the political system has become all about money, where it didn't used to be nearly as much about money. Actually, I forgot to talk about in high context, low context. High context cultures are cultures like Asian cultures, a lot of African nations, a lot of Central and South American cultures are very high context cultures, whereas America, Canada, Great Britain, these are cultures that are very low context cultures. So we've talked about individualistic, we've talked about context, we've talked about power distance. Now we're going to move to whether or not a culture is masculine or feminine. Masculine cultures are cultures where everything is based on traditional gender roles, right? So in a masculine culture, men do men things and women do women things. And in a traditional masculine culture, men are valued because they have masculine traits, aggressiveness, they have material success, they have physical and mental and emotional strength, right? And so those traits are valued. And so the reason men are valued in that kind of culture is because they have those traits. And women are valued in a masculine culture because they have more feminine traits such as modesty, the focus on the life of other people, being tender, being caregivers, right? In a masculine culture, women do things like nursing and teaching and caregivers, where men do men things like police and military and firefighters and construction workers. And you know, in a masculine society, the society as a whole values like ambition, as assertiveness, and competitiveness, right? They value strategies of conflict that are win-lose, meaning I win, you lose. Very aggressive. You know, cultures, a lot of Latin American cultures, a lot of Latin cultures in general are very masculine-based. Mexico, Italy, Spain, these are cultures that are masculine cultures. Then you have cultures that are feminine cultures. And here's the thing. They're not opposites. All the other ones we've talked about are opposites. But feminine cultures don't value feminine traits over masculine traits, except for the fact that most feminine traits are just better for people. Feminine cultures are cultures where it isn't about traditional gender roles, meaning anybody can do any kind of job and not get looked at like they're weird. So in some of the Norwegian countries, Denmark, Sweden, and so on, they're much more feminine cultures where people don't blink an eye to see a stay-at-home dad who plays the role that in a masculine culture would be played by a woman. And it doesn't matter. It's okay. You know, the focus is on the relationships more than who does what in a particular relation. Who does what? It's about the nature of the relationship. You know, men and women are valued for similar traits. And those traits are what, in a masculine society, the traits that are valued in a feminine culture are the traits that in a masculine culture are traditionally associated with the feminine, which is modesty, you know, strong concern for relationships, tenderness, caring about things, you know, caring about the lives of others. And they're valued, again, not because they're feminine, but because they're the right thing to do. They believe that people should treat people with respect. And when it comes to conflict strategies, they pick strategies that both sides win. You know, they tend to collaborate and compromise more, whereas in a masculine culture, it's about winning. It's about bullying the other person in conflict. So that's masculine and feminine. Again, these aren't different. They aren't, you know, they're not opposite like the other ones are. They're just completely different. Then we're going to talk about, the next one is how that culture views ambiguity, how they view the unknown. And you have societies, you have cultures that are high ambiguity tolerant cultures. And what this means is they expect uncertainty. It's normal. They like to take risks. They are comfortable with the unknown. They're comfortable with multiple perspectives on things. There are fewer cultural rules in a high ambiguity tolerant culture simply because it doesn't matter. They're not afraid of risk. They're not afraid with ambiguity. They're not afraid to be flexible. You know, they tend to be more accepting for things that aren't the norm. So they accept differences much more easily than low ambiguity tolerant cultures. High ambiguity cultures would be most of the Western cultures. And yes, there are certain aspects, like for example, the United States. As a whole, we are very high ambiguity. We take risks. We're not afraid of things. But there are things that we as a culture still have issues with. You know, a lot of people have issues with gay rights and gay marriage. But as a whole, we have become much more tolerant of things that are not the norm. Whereas in a low ambiguity tolerant culture, they have no tolerance for the unknown. They avoid uncertainty. Everything is planned out. Everything's detailed and specific. A lot of Asian cultures are low ambiguity tolerant. They have rules for communication. They have rules for relationships. They have rules for everything. Timelines are very important in low ambiguity tolerance because if you can't plan things using a timeline, timetable, then you're going to screw up things, and it's cause the unknown. It's going to cause who knows what's going to happen as a result. In America, if you're supposed to catch a bus at 3 o'clock, what time might that bus show up? Might show up at 3 o'clock, but then again, it might not show up till 3:10. It might show up at 2:50, right? So you can't count on it. It's unknown. But most Americans are okay with that. Now, individually, that might annoy you, but as a society, we're okay with that. But there are places, and like many Asian cultures, many European countries, where if a train's supposed to come at 3 o'clock, it comes at 3 o'clock. You can literally set your watch to it. It does not come at 2:58. It does not come at 3:01. It comes at 3 o'clock because they do not like the unknown. They don't like taking risks. So how does this impact us? Well, in a high ambiguity tolerant culture, you're not afraid of risks, right? So, for example, let's say you're out at your favorite adult establishment and you see somebody that you find attractive. In a high ambiguity tolerant culture, you're not afraid to go up and start talking to them. Hey, how you doing? Because you're not necessarily afraid of that unknown, that uncertainty. Now, individually, you may be. I am. I could never do that. I had my friends offered me $100 to talk to this girl when I was leaving Denver that I had been staring at for like 6 years, and I couldn't do it. They offered me. They put money on the table. I couldn't do it because I don't deal well with uncertainty. I'm a Virgo. I like things being orderly and everything's all got to be a certain way. So me personally, I tend to be very low ambiguity tolerant in most things, where other people in my culture, it's no big deal. But in a low ambiguity tolerant culture, because you are afraid of risk, you don't deal well with the unknown, you're much more likely to not go up and talk to that person. You would try to meet them, like you would try to take your group of friends and meet their group of friends as a whole, or try to find somebody that you know that knows that person. So you're more likely to meet them through other people because you're afraid. You're more nervous of that uncertainty. What is that? What if she says no? Or what if that person doesn't like me or wants to talk to me? And that's what low ambiguity tolerant cultures are. They don't like to take risks. They're much more intolerant of the unknown, of anything that's outside of the norm, right? If it's not the norm, they don't like it. Again, a lot of Asian cultures tend to be low ambiguity tolerant cultures. And I talk about Japan a lot because Japan's just the one that I'm most familiar with. And when I talk about Japan, I'm really not talking about Tokyo, because Tokyo is its own world. Tokyo is a lot like New York City in that even though it's part of our country, it's really not. It's its own entity, and it doesn't necessarily follow the same rules as the rest of Japan. So when I talk about some people might be into like anime or whatever, and but Tokyo isn't like that. Well, the rest of Japan is. And the last way in which we classify culture is how that culture views time. How, are they focused on the long term, the future, planning and preparing everything for the future, or are they short term? Like, I'm focused on now, I'm focused on what happened 5 years ago, I expect things to happen now, I don't care about the future. Now, where do you think America falls? Yep, short term, right? We're all about now, 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 now. I expect my results very quickly. I expect everything to be given to me now. Which is why we have so many problems with old people in the United States starving to death, because they didn't plan for their future. That's why so many people are going into massive debt, because they didn't plan for their future when they were young. I will give you the best piece of advice I can give you, especially to those of you who are young. Start an investment account now. Put $25 in it a month and just let it put it as highly aggressive and just let it grow. $25 a month, just have them take it directly out of your paycheck. Because by the time you're my age or some other people's age that might be in this class, you're going to have a good chunk of money. Now is the best time because it doesn't really hurt you that much. If you wait, you're screwed. So Long-term cultures would, a lot of Asian cultures are focused on the long term. A lot of European countries are focused more on the long term than the short term. Although, as we become more culturally diverse globally, these rules break down a little bit. So that is how we classify cultures. Now, as I said earlier, our goal is to have good, effective interpersonal or intercultural communication. And intercultural communication is simply communication between people of two cultures whose beliefs and values and etc. are different enough to cause confusion, to cause conflict, right? Even though you are part of many, many, many cultures, most of those cultures are similar enough that it doesn't actually impact your communication that much on a daily basis. So that's not necessarily true intercultural communication. Intercultural communication is the communication needs to be altered in some way because of the cultural differences. So how do you improve intercultural communication? Well, do certain things. Prepare yourself, right? Learn about other cultures. If you know that you're going to be going to China for work, does it not make sense to learn about their culture? Learn about their linguistic practices. Learn about their nonverbal gestures. You don't want to be like, Richard M. Nixon, who went to China for the first time. A president went to China, and he got off the plane and he did his traditional, this, and he essentially flipped off the entire country because to them that was an insult. Actually, that happens quite a bit when leaders from one country go to another. They do something unintentionally that ends up pissing everybody off. So learn about another culture. The best way to communicate and reduce instances of conflict or confusion is to simply learn about that culture. Reduce ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the belief that your culture is superior to all other cultures, regardless of evidence on the contrary. Now, some of you are like, well, I love America. Well, I love America too, but I also know we got some major issues because ethnocentrism leads to stereotyping, it leads to conflict, it leads to needless conflict, and that's bad. America is great, but we have a lot of issues. We're way at the bottom in so many categories when it comes to education. We are one of the most developed countries in the world, and yet our infant mortality rate and mother death rate during birth is so high. Why? And that's the thing, is you got to understand that your culture has problems. And if you don't do that, if you don't understand that your culture has problems, you're going to go out there and you're essentially going to be a bully, and you're going to bully other cultures. This is why so many other countries have issues with Americans. It's because they go over there and they act like our poop don't stink, and we act like we're the king of the hill, which in many ways we are, but in many ways we're not anymore, and it causes problems. So reduce that. Understand, just because a culture is different doesn't mean it's better. I have seen people ridicule Middle Eastern men because they're holding hands. Not because they're gay, but in Middle Eastern culture, men hold hands. And in some Middle Eastern cultures, men holding hands is perfectly normal. And that's because people in my culture are assuming superiority because in our culture, holding hands, guys don't hold hands, right? Don't do that. Because it leads to stereotypes, which you should avoid. Confront your stereotypes. We see this a lot with people from the Middle East, especially after 9/11. We saw all of these stereotypes of Middle Eastern people, right? And so we began to treat people from the Middle East, regardless of what country they're from, in a way that I consider to be unacceptable. You should not see somebody as their culture. You should not see somebody as an Iranian or an Iraqi. You should see them as who they are, as an individual person, right? They are a person first, then they are their culture. So look at them as a person. Don't put them in that folder. Remember perception. Your initial, instinct is to put them in a folder. That's okay. Iranian. But as you get to know them, you need to move them out of that and put them into their own folder so that you treat them as an individual, not as an Iranian. Because you don't know anything about Iranians, so your idea of what an Iranian is going to be skewed. It's prejudiced and it's going to lead to discrimination. Be mindful. There it is again. Be mindful, right? As opposed to mindless. Avoid illogical assumptions. Like this idea that all Islamic people are terrorists. There are people, probably people who are sitting in this room watching this video, who believe that all Muslims are terrorists. Because that's what the media, that's what people want you to think. And that's just not true at all. I know plenty of Muslims that have never blown up a building. So don't give in to that illogic fear-mongering that the media wants you to buy into. I have seen people that don't want to touch people with cancer because they're just illogically afraid that they're going to get cancer. I have seen people refuse to shake people who have HIV's hand because they're afraid they're going to get HIV. Completely illogical, completely ridiculous, but in their mind, that's stupid. And so it leads to discrimination, it leads to stereotyping, and that is bad. So remember, mindfulness is always a good thing. Understand your own limitations and just be open. That's what mindfulness means. Reduce uncertainty. The bigger the difference between your culture and another, the longer that's going to take. But use active listening, which we've talked about. Use perception checking, which we've talked about. Go back to the perception chapter and think about all of those things for reducing uncertainty and improving your perceptions about things. Use all of those tools when it comes to dealing with cultures that you are not familiar with. Recognize that cultures are different. Don't make assumptions about similarities or differences. Just because somebody looks like you or talks like you doesn't mean that their culture is the same. But on the flip side, just because cultures are different than you and have different practices doesn't mean that they're that different. Be patient, accept ambiguity, adjust your communication practices to accommodate differences with those cultures. So for example, if you're dealing with somebody from Asia and you know that Asian folks tend to not like eye contact, you shouldn't be all trying to make eye contact with them. You have to say, you know what, I understand, they're not trying to be shady, they're not trying to hide something. That is just something that particular culture does. Or if you're dealing with a culture that stands really close, one of the worst things you can do is back away from people in those cultures. It's very insulting to them. And when you start a communication occurrence off, a conversation off, by insulting the person that you're in a conversation with, that's never a good way to start a good intercultural communication session. Understand that cultures are different and accept that ambiguity and be flexible. Be flexible. And lastly, you want to recognize culture shock. And culture shock is basically any time that somebody feels discomfort within a communication or within a situation, right? It could be anything. When I worked at the Grand Canyon, people come out there and it was very isolated. And some people didn't react well to that because they were used to being in a big city with lots and lots of people around them all the time. When I first moved back to Pennsylvania from living in Denver, and I went to a Taco Bell or I went to some restaurant, and they didn't accept credit cards, and I was skeeved out. I literally didn't know what to do. That's culture shock. We think of culture shock when somebody from a small town goes to a big town, right? How many of you have ever been to New York City? And that's like you were in New York City and you're just like, oh my God, this thing is ridiculous, right? Because it's so big, it's so immense, it's so, it's hard to wrap your mind around the concept of New York City. But that works the other way too. It works the other way too, where if you're from a big town and you go to a small town, things are going to be different. And you're going to be just as weirded out because you're used to things being a certain way. So you need to recognize that culture shock so that you can adapt to it and not give into that culture shock. So culture shock is normal, and you got to be aware of it so that you don't freak out. So that is culture in a nutshell. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. Have a nice day. Stay out of trouble. Don't do drugs.